Okay, so recently we've just finished a project looking at the benefits, costs and risks of global sourcing. This is a big area that companies are looking at, and Cranfield is very much involved in driving forward a big research project for the Department for Transport. That's right, isn't it? Do you want to tell us a bit about that project?
Yes, well, back in 2006 we were requested by the Department for Transport to undertake this research project looking at exactly the subject that you mentioned, the benefits, the cost and the risks of global sourcing decisions, looking at how companies are making these decisions and how we can help them to improve the way they make those decisions. So, yeah, that was essentially what the project was about.
So who was involved in this project? Because we had a big research team from Cranfield, but also we had quite a few external people, external companies involved in that.
That's correct. It was a multidisciplinary team, a number of people from Cranfield, people with expertise on supply chain management in general, people with expertise on global sourcing, particularly sourcing from the Far East and from China, people with expertise on risk management. So a relatively large team internally within Cranfield, and also a couple of external consultants who particularly had expertise on the modelling side, because one of the important outputs of the project was a computer model that essentially can help people make global sourcing decisions.
Now, the total project, it lasted 14 months, didn't it? And I remember very clearly that really we had our goal of what we were going to try and achieve with this project, but over time a couple of issues really came to a head. Do you want to just talk around some of those issues? I think it was really some of the environmental issues really started to come into focus, didn't they?
I think one of the most interesting issues that came out of the project was that at the beginning we were looking at risks of global sourcing in general. And by far the biggest risk that emerged during the research project was the risk to the environment, the effects that global sourcing decisions are having on the environment. Because when you decide to outsource a product that you were building in the UK, you decide to move to the Far East or Southeast Asia or somewhere else, of course you're going to transport it for much longer, and that has implications in terms of pollution, implications on CO2 emissions, which obviously create global warming, and it also has other ethical implications of, you know, how do people make the product in all of these countries, and what is the degree of control you have over these new suppliers.
And it brings in to focus the whole issue of supply chain assurance, which is really what are the processes we have in place to really ensure what's going on. I think one of the interesting things about this is also the lead time issue that people tend to overlook, because if you think about the cash-to-cash cycles, often we're running at a cash-to-cash cycle, if you're looking at nice locally sourced supply chains, of sort of 9 weeks, 8-9 weeks, whereas you can be up to 20 weeks, if not greater, if you're looking at a global sourcing decision. And often I think that a lot of people overlook that, because you've got to find some money to fund all that additional inventory in the supply chain and all that additional cost in the supply chain.
Absolutely. As you make the supply chain longer, you're obviously going to have more inventory, or you're going to have your cash tied up for a much longer period of time. And of course, as we started seeing interest rates increasing, that becomes a bigger amount of money that's tied up for a longer amount of time. So people are starting to reconsider some decisions that they made in the past of sourcing from the Far East. If you're going to have a product on a ship for 13 or 15 weeks, well, that has implications not only for cost, also implications for responsiveness. Because if you suddenly realize that there's no demand for this particular product, well, you're in a difficult situation when you have container after container of product somewhere on its way to your distribution centers.
I think it's fair to say that there are benefits from global sourcing, and that was one of the things that was found from this research project. That I remember one of them was the whole issue that companies say, well, we want to do global sourcing, we want to sort of source from another market because our markets are shifting. So we want to actually put our facilities and start building relationships in China, because ultimately China might be a market we're operating in. So the benefit is we're going to get market access as part of this. And there was other issues which I found were quite interesting.
But I think the most interesting one is the one you've just mentioned. Companies outsource to other countries not only to find cheaper sources for their products, but also to essentially put a foot on these emerging markets. So if you set up a new factory in China or a new factory in India or in Indonesia, that means you can start also selling your product within those markets. And some of these countries, you're only allowed to sell if you produce in there. So it's an opportunity to exploit these huge markets. I mean, if we think in volumes of people, clearly, I mean, the population of China is, what, 20 times that of the UK. So the size of the market has no basis of comparison.
It's, I think, one of the big issues was this whole issue of the CO2 and the model which was created, and I've used this in teaching sessions as you have, is quite fascinating, because what people are able to do is to put in their costs into this model. It also calculates, depending on the way that you actually transport the goods, how much CO2 is created. It then actually puts a cost of carbon onto that as well. So you might say, I'm going to fly the goods, or I'm going to take the stuff through by boat, and you're able to scenario plan with it. Now, it's quite interesting now, here we are sitting in 2008, because a lot of the original figures we put into that model, things have doubled now, haven't they, really? I mean, look at the oil price, which was factored in, that's doubled. So that's going to create a much bigger need, I would say, for these sorts of models in the future, to be able to sort of plan our supply chains more effectively.
Well,
and understand
absolutely.
what's happening.
What the model does, it compares two sourcing locations. So you can say, if I source my product from France and I source my product from Indonesia, what are the differences in terms of cost, in terms of time, and in terms of distance traveled, and as a result on CO2 emissions. So it allows you to look at the trade-offs. So if you send it from China, it's clearly going to take longer, it's going to emit more CO2, and it also allows you to change different transport modes, because if you want to have it quickly from China, you could fly it, right? And it would be here next day. But the amount of CO2 that you would emit by flying it from China, if you think a plane emits 100 more times CO2 than a ship does, well, if you're substituting a ship by a plane, you're essentially multiplying CO2 emissions by 100. So quite substantial implications. And yeah, you were talking about these changes to some of the factors, particularly in terms of the price of oil, which, you know, has skyrocketed in the last few months. These are parameters that we need to keep on updating on the model, because when we originally developed the model, the price of oil was $60 a barrel. Now we're talking $140 a barrel, more than double the price. What are the implications for global sourcing? They are substantial, because you're transporting product for longer distances. So definitely we're looking at these variables, and companies are using this to reassess their global sourcing decisions, because and what made sense 6 months ago might not make sense today. And
we should say that this model it's freely available. That's right. Companies are using it, playing with it. So a great example of Cranfield's knowledge into practice.